This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt, Lindala.
And I'm Frida, Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida, Waara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. Frida, today I'm looking forward to. I like with a lot of the folks that we talk to here on the podcast and everything, all the stories that they tell. But today we've got something that really, I think for a lot of people, when you hear the big lake and Lake Superior, we hear about shipwrecks and what has happened there. And we're going to touch base here today with a fellow that is an author, a shipwreck historian, a researcher, and, he's from around the area of the big lake as well. We got some conversations coming up here.
You know, Walt, you and I go way back to when the Coast Guard cutter Mesquite went down.
Yes.
And we did that documentary, Superior Destiny, I think.
Yes, it was.
And that's when I first heard Dan's name, because we were working with Eric Smith at the time at public television and just really knew a lot of what was happening around the lakes. But it's under the surface, I guess. Sometimes you don't get a chance to really understand that this big blue is so fascinating. The surface, the surrounding areas, the communities, the parks, of course. But let's take a dive under.
Yeah,
and let's talk to Dan.
Let's talk to Dan here a little bit about what's on the bottom in some areas and how he's researched that. Dan Fountain joins us here on the podcast, author and shipwreck historian, as well as a researcher. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me.
You know, this is really going to be interesting. I mean, this is something that I grew up near Lake Superior on Portage Lake in the Keweenaw Peninsula of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I've grown up on the water. I've always enjoyed the idea of going sort of diving and looking under and seeing what's down there. And that's what you do. So tell us a little bit first how you came to explore Lake Superior in this way.
Well, I've probably been exploring Lake Superior since I was a small child. My parents bought a piece of property and built a camp when I was 3 years old down on the Lake Superior shore. My dad used to row us in a small rowboat about a mile down the shoreline, down to Shot Point, where there was the remains of an old sailing ship on the bottom. We didn't know what it was at the time. We just called it the wreck.
Mm-hmm.
But he'd row us down there, my brother and myself, and I think I was 8 years old the first time I jumped out of the boat and swam down about 6 feet and touched this piece of an old shipwreck, and I've been hooked ever since.
Right from the get-go, yeah. People need to understand, Dan, just give us a little inkling. Now, 6 feet under, you're already down to probably where the surface water's not too warm. What was that like around Shot Point, too? I mean, there's a lot of wave action there.
Well, there were, 3 or 4 of us in a small rowboat, so we only went there on nice days. And we had grown up, spent our childhoods on the lake, and we knew it was cold. We were used to it, but being kids, you don't feel it anyway.
Right. Now, you said that you were hooked right and then from that early age. How did that develop then for you into what you do and have been doing as a career and with this interest?
Well, as I say, I was always interested in it from a young age. And in 1979, I said, there's a scuba diving class going on. I should get certified and learn to scuba dive. So 1979. Took the class in the fall, and as part of the class, we have to do a 3 or 4 certification dives. And this was October by the time I finished the classwork and the pool work, so we went out for our certification dives, and we went to the Upper Harbor, Presque Isle, right inside the breakwater.
Mm-hmm.
And a snowstorm came in. So we were out there scuba diving in a snowstorm.
Right off the coast of the Marquette, basically, in that area. And yeah. Mm-hmm. I know it very well. I've been living in this area for 30-some years. And yes, it's definitely that comes in. So that didn't sour you on it. You kept going, right?
Well, it also seems like it's a great segue to just the idea that, you know, if there's estimates of 550 shipwrecks on Lake Superior and perhaps half of those are still undiscovered, I think just getting this inkling from Dan, why it is so difficult to find these ships.
Yeah. What is that part of it for you, Dan, or for the people that look for them? Is this these conditions?
Conditions on the lake contributed to the shipwrecks happening in the first place. But the difficulties in finding them probably come down to just the vast space, the vast area of the lake, and the fact that many of these shipwrecks are in deep water where you have to have some sort of technology to help you find them.
So are there ships that perhaps you are still kind of looking for? Are there some that are out there that are sort of just on your list that I want to try to track these down?
Oh, yeah. We've got a number of wrecks that are, I would say, eminently findable. It's just going to take time, energy, a lot of miles out on the lake. Basically, time and the use of technology to find these things under anywhere from a few feet of water to hundreds of feet of water.
Walk us through that path. How do you begin to look for a ship?
Well, a big part of shipwreck hunting happens this time of year during the winter, where I'm looking at old records, newspaper articles, wreck reports, official government reports, and we can find them to try to put together an idea of where this wreck might be. Just to go out and say, well, I'm going to go out and look in the lake to see if there's a shipwreck out there somewhere. You'll spend a lot of time on the lake and hopefully enjoyable time on the lake, but you're not likely to find anything. Mm-hmm. So you try to narrow down the area and look there. What we end up doing, the old-fashioned way of doing it, let's say, is to go out with a side-scanning sonar and just go back and forth. We call it mowing the lawn. You're going back and forth in parallel lines, making sure you cover everything. Now, a side-scanning sonar is a little different from a normal fish finder you might have on a boat or depth finder. Side-scanning sonar is usually a towfish that's towed behind and below the boat, and this shoots out a sonar beam off to the sides, looking for anything that's rising up off the bottom. And you have to go back and forth with your side-scanning sonar. The one I'm using is fairly modern. It can look maximum of 1,250 feet on each side, of which we can probably trust anywhere from all of it to half of it. So we always overlap our lanes. We're covering everything, most everything twice.
So when we look at this, then you've got this information and you have probably developed the skills, the training, the understanding of when you see something on it. I mean, is it sometimes just a little bit of an anomaly on the screen, or is it sometimes very clear? I mean, tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, what you're looking for on the screen, what you always want to see is this beautiful thing that looks just like a shipwreck.
Right.
That's pretty rare. Right. A lot of times you'll see a smudge or a blob or a dark spot or a light spot, depending. And it takes a certain amount of experience, expertise to say, okay, that is likely to be a shipwreck, or no, that definitely isn't. And usually it's a matter of taking a location, and whether immediately or later on, taking another look at the anomaly.
And you have an idea that perhaps something was in that area that went down, according to the reports that you can put together and harvest and find out that. Now, you just recently have been in the news with the discovery of a vessel named the Arlington. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how and where you found it and a little bit of this? Because this is a fascinating story.
No kidding. Talk about looking for a 4-leaf clover in a field of grass.
Tell us about the Arlington.
Well, the Arlington was a somewhat serendipitous find. we were actually expecting to find another shipwreck. Some friends of mine have developed a use for some remote sensing data that was collected years ago for another purpose other than shipwreck hunting, but able to find this rather obscure trove of data. And the guy's wife is a software engineer. I'm not sure if that's her title. I call her a very good computer nerd.
There you go.
She figured out a way to analyze this data and emphasize anomalies in there that might be a shipwreck. And from doing some of this analysis in an area out near the middle of Lake Superior, we came up with two anomalies actually close to each other, and said that's got to be something on the bottom. So it's 35 miles out of Copper Harbor, which is farther than I'm willing to take my small boat. And the water's deeper there than the sonar that I'm using would be effective in. So I talked to the folks down at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, the Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, and they were willing to take their research vessel, the David Boyd, and run it up to Copper Harbor and take it out and to use their state-of-the-art side scan to look for this wreck. So the crew from the Shipwreck Historical Society made the 200-mile run from Whitefish Point to Marquette up to Copper Harbor. And 23rd of July this year, we set out with first light on the morning and headed out into the lake. About a 3.5-hour run out to the anomalies. Once we got close, we dropped the side scan sonar in and started looking. Came to the first anomaly, nothing there. Got to this location of the second anomaly, and we're waiting, looking, and all of a sudden this thing pops up about 25 feet off of a flat calm bottom. We realized, okay, that's the shipwreck. We went right over it.
So that's what you saw. It was just kind of a sort of an image, a bump, and then you said this must be it. So then what? I mean, you have this, you kind of put this together. What do you do then? I mean, what's the next thing that sort of happens?
Well, first thing, as I say, we went right over it, so we have no idea exactly what it is. It's something standing up 25 feet off the bottom. We turned the boat around, dragged the sonar past it again, and got a good image that says, yes, it is indeed a shipwreck. And then once we had the location, the orientation of it down very exactly, we were able to run quite close to it, quite slow and very low down with the fish, and get a very high resolution image of the wreck. After that, after we realized, yes, it is a shipwreck, we know exactly where it sits, we dropped a hook, dropped an anchor, and sent down a remote-operated vehicle, an ROV. This is I guess you'd call it an underwater drone.
Mm-hmm. Sure, of course.
Cable-controlled from the surface, so we have probably 3 or 4 people out on the deck handling the cable, feeding out the cable, pulling in the cable as needed, and one operator, another guy observing, being an extra set of hands if needed inside the boat, watching on sonar and video screens as we maneuver over to the wreck.
And then after you do that, you have the opportunity to kind of check and see it a little bit clearer, I'm sure. And then once you can confirm it, you are underway there. Then you've kind of made that kind of positive identification.
Yeah, this wasn't the wreck that we were looking for. The first dive we made with the ROV, put it in, dropped down, navigated by sonar over to the stern of the vessel. We could tell which end was which. And looked across the fantail expecting to see a name, and there were some letters there, but they weren't spelling the name that we expected. And finally realized that it says Arlington.
Uh-huh.
And we weren't really looking for Arlington. That's there were wreck reports on that saying it was 12.5 miles from Superior Shoal, and this is more like 20-some miles from Superior Shoal. So it was in about 20, and in a different direction. So this was really not where Arlington was reported to be.
But, Dan, it had to feel like you just won the lottery. Oh, my goodness.
There were some pretty big grins in that cabin.
So, okay, here's the question now. And we're talking with Dan Fountain here on the podcast today, author and shipwreck historian and researcher about shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. We're right now talking about the Arlington. Arlington has a very unique story, and I've learned this after the information came out, after the discovery of the wreck. And can you tell us a little bit about what you know about the ship, the captain, the crew? There's a connection with the captain and the going down with the ship. This is a fascinating story. Tell us about this.
Yeah, the captain was a highly experienced mariner. He had been sailing since he was 15, and he was just short of his 55th birthday, so he'd been sailing for 40 years on the Great Lakes. He had been worked his way up, working on small wooden lumber towing tugs, worked his way up to captaining one of the tugs, worked his way up to larger steel vessels, and became well-respected captain. On this particular voyage, he didn't seem to be himself. The vessel left Port Arthur, what's now known as Thunder Bay in Ontario, with a cargo of wheat, and started heading down the lake. They were bound for the southern end of Georgian Bay on Lake Huron. Ordinarily, the captain would be on the bridge for the more critical parts of the journey. In this case, he just stayed in his cabin, let the first and second mate take turns at the command of the vessel. Once they got out into open water, the weather seemed to be kicking up, and the first mate, Jonas Maxey, decided that the prudent thing to do would be to, rather than go straight across the lake for Whitefish Point, to kind of hug the north shore, what they call the northern route, which would give them a lot more shelter, fewer waves, less exposure to the wind. As they went out into the open water, they were feeling this beam sea, and they were rolling. And the mate decided let's make the turn to take the northern route. As soon as he had made that turn and the motion of the vessel changed, Captain came storming out of his cabin up into the pilot house and said, "Get back on course. We're going straight across the lake." First mate said, "Well, you're the captain." And so they continued on out into the lake. As the farther they got out into the lake, the more the wind picked up, the more the vessel was rolling. Waves were sweeping across the deck. Now, this was a small vessel. It was only 244 feet long. Some of the vessels that Captain Burke had commanded before that were in the 300, 400, 500-foot range. So it was a little smaller than he was accustomed to. This was his first or second trip on that particular vessel, and perhaps he was sailing into weather that wouldn't have been a problem for the bigger boats, but turned out to be a problem for the Arlington. Waves were sweeping over the deck. This was an older vessel that had a cargo of wheat, which was sealed in by wooden hatch covers, and the hatch covers were covered by tarps, and the tarps were held down by steel bars, basically to keep any water that comes over the deck from getting into the hold and getting the wheat wet and ruining it. Well, the waves are rolling across the deck, sometimes as much as 10 feet over the deck, and they started to tear some of these tarps loose, and they were concerned that they were going to get water in the hold. So again, the mate turned the vessel into the wind so that the crew could get out on the deck and fix these tarps. As soon as they made that turn, once again the captain noticed the change in the motion of the vessel. Came out on deck, came up to the pilot house, and again ordered the wheelsman to put her back on course for Whitefish. And he said something to the effect that we're never going to get anywhere if we're going in the wrong direction. Back into his cabin, and was not heard from again.
So
sometimes
somewhere in there, then it capsized, it went under, but the crew, if I remember the story, at least what I saw, was the crew able to get off of the vessel, but the captain did not?
Yeah, let's see where to start. Yeah, they get a little farther down the lake, another hour or two down the lake after the last time they had tried to secure the tarps. Waves were getting bigger. By this time, they could see that at least one of the tarps was gone, another one was loose, and finally, the ship started to take on enough water that it was starting to lift, starting to tilt to the port side. The mate sent the mate sent a crewman down to rouse Captain Burke. Tried to get him to come out and come up to the pilot house. He didn't respond. Finally, the mate himself went down. He demanded that the captain come up to the pilot house and take command so that they could try to do something with the tarps. So Burke grumblingly came out of his cabin, came up to the pilot house. I think at that point he realized that, okay, this ship is in trouble. And he turned it into the wind and started heading for the North Shore. But it was too little, too late. It had already taken on enough water that it was starting to sink. The boiler fires had been put out. They were, at this point, at the mercy of the wind. They fell into the trough of the waves and were just drifting. Fortunately, another vessel had left Port Arthur at the same time, a vessel called the Collingwood. And they had actually followed the Arlingtons, kept on the same course for a couple of reasons. The Arlington was equipped with wireless, which is to say Morse code radio that they used in those days. This is 1940. And he also had a radio direction finder, so he was better able to navigate and know his actual position on the lake than the Collingwood, which was a much larger, newer vessel but did not have these modern conveniences. Well, fortunately, the Collingwood had been keeping station, staying in formation with Arlington as they crossed the lake, and he could see that they were in trouble. And so he got as close as he dared to the other vessel. He got as close as he dared to the Arlington. And once the Arlington lost power and started to lift severely, the chief engineer ordered everybody to abandon ship. They lowered one lifeboat, and the whole crew got in there. Last person to leave the pilot house was, I believe it was a wheelsman, asked Captain Burke, "Are you coming?" and just didn't really get any reply. If it was, he might have mumbled something unintelligible and stayed up in the pilot house. Everybody got onto the lifeboat, rowed over toward the Collingwood, and they got about 50 yards away from the Arlington, and it went down. The last they saw of Captain Burke, he was standing up by his cabin or the pilot house, and some of them say, well, he waved to us. Whether he was waving goodbye or if he was waving, saying, "Hey, come back and get me," I don't know. I don't think we'll ever know.
I don't think we will.
Fascinating story.
And what a story to go with the find that you had with finding the Arlington. If people want to find out maybe more about this dive and other things that find about, visiting the various shipwrecks and everything to learn more about what you do and with your colleagues in this field, how can they find out more? What's a good way to do that?
Well, a good start is the Whitefish Point Shipwreck Museum. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society has a fantastic museum at Whitefish Point. Here in Marquette Museum has some beautiful displays and is well worth a visit. So
I do have a question for you, Dan. Dan Fountain with us on the podcast. He's an author, shipwreck historian, and researcher. Are there places in particular that you like to dive? Is there somewhere that you like to go searching and diving?
Well, I haven't been doing much diving for a number of years now. I got kind of a natural notice saying I'm past my best by date, but
I like that.
Okay, so when you still were, before you were starting to not, get closer to expiration, where'd you like to go? Where did you like to go diving?
Most of my diving has been done mostly on Lake Superior, mostly freshwater, although I have had some enjoyable vacations down to the Caribbean and warm water.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Lake Superior is my favorite place to dive still. Spend a lot of time down in the Munising area, from one side of Grand Island to the far end of the Pictured Rocks. There are beautiful places to dive, and it's just being on the water there and enjoying the scenery is a lot of fun. There are several nice dives around Marquette, and again, the scenery, just to see the lake, or just to see the Marquette and the island, the shoreline from out on the lake is always a pleasure.
Dan, when you do look for a ship and you're spending your winter, I'm sure, combing all those publications and reports, is there one that is still, it kind of like, I don't want to use the analogy pops to the surface because that's not going to happen. But for you, that you just got to go find this ship still.
Yeah, I won't name it right now because it'll be I'm hoping this summer will be our next discovery. But we've spent I think the first time we went looking for this was 2016, and we've looked for it more or less 2016, 2017, 21, 22, 23, probably 2020 also. So, yeah, there's one in Market County waters that we've been looking for, covered over 150 square miles looking for it, and hoping that we have run out of places to look and we'll find it.
Oh, me too. Me too. Oh, wow. That's exciting. It's got me kind of like, okay, ready. The next episode.
When you find it, we'll do another one of these. But, really, it's been a pleasure just chatting with you today, learning this history. There's so much more to the lake, especially under the surface, than what we see and what we experience when we're walking around on the shore, or hiking and camping. And you've given us some really good insight, Dan, and a fascinating story about the Arlington. And I know you're also getting the word out on that over the next several months, that people, if they have questions, they can find you, especially perhaps through the Maritime Museum in Marquette. But we just want to thank you for your time today, Dan. It's just been a pleasure of a chat.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I always like to talk to people who are really interested in hearing what I've got to say.
Well, it's really been some interesting stuff to talk about, and Frida's over here just smiling.
Well, and I know we've got to get Dan back to talk a little bit about his books about the gold and silver and mining in our area. So that's next on the agenda.
Hey, Dan, thank you for your time with us today.
Well, thanks again for having me on this podcast.
That's Dan Fountain. He's author, a shipwreck historian, and researcher. And Frida, lots of interesting information, in particular about the Arlington, that story. It's one of those that, yes, as he said, like with the Maritime Museum, everybody's got the Edmund Fitzgerald for Lake Superior. There's always some kind of display and discussion about it. But there's so many other stories, just like the Arlingtons.
Yes, Captain Frederick Burke, in his mid-50s, had been on the water basically for 40 years. And to go down with that ship, and that happened May 1st of 1940. So imagine that ship full of grain. And as Dan described, I could just understand those waves washing over that 244-foot ship and, just canvas covers over those wooden hatches with those metal bars and those pry bars. We've got to see some more pictures of that Arlington. And I think you're going to have an opportunity because Dan will also be speaking at the end of July, 2024 at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum Historical Society, I believe in Whitefish Point.
I know he's starting to tell the story on this vessel in particular, especially because it was kind of a surprise find for one thing, but then to have a story like it does, and when the story came out about the Arlington being discovered, the wreck of the Arlington being discovered, the story was the crew basically was able to get off of the vessel. The captain did not and went down with the ship. And we hear that all the time. The captain goes down with the ship. According to what Dan just told us, I think there was some things going on. And you know what? It's just the lore of the Great Lakes, the lore of Lake Superior.
Absolutely. And maybe we can nudge Dan to write another book because he has a couple of books out already. This may very well be one.
Look up Dan Fountain. He's an author, shipwreck historian, researcher, historian of other types as well. And he's been our guest today on the Lake Superior podcast. If there's an episode idea for us, please forward it through the the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation website. Send us your comments, send us your thoughts, and follow the podcast, link it up, share it with your friends. We've always got some fascinating stories about what's going on the big lake, the big blue Lake Superior. That's going to do it for us this time around on the podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.